Welcome to the second of this year's Abundance Talks. My name is Lucia Alais. I'm the director of the Buell Center. The Abundance Talk series and the associated Abundance Project comes out of the Buell's work on investigating the relationship of architecture and land, but brings work that turns our attention more specifically to the way that land's apparently limitless natural abundance in the United States has been understood as a kind of guarantee of political freedom, including through architecture. So today's event is called Flammable Building. It takes us to a period in the 19th century when the built environment is entirely flammable, and the economic imaginary of the United States is reinvented around the material value of timber on one hand and insurance on the other. And you'll see that architecture plays a part in this. Before I introduce our speakers and get to it, let me begin, as is customary, by drawing from the history of the land upon which the campus is built. So bear with me for a few minutes. Of all days, I would be remiss if I didn't return to this finding that we had, which is that the first written record of the island of Mannahatta, of the word Mannahatta, is found in the journal of an English crewman aboard Henry Hudson's ship named Robert Jewett, who wrote that as the ship approached the island, colonists, quote, saw not land, but a great fire. In other words, what European settlers first encountered was not ground as a surface to settle, but fire as a signal and a tool of the environmental management practices of the Lenape people, who traversed the site, periodically stayed in wooden encampments, and set autumnal fires to ensure that the ground would be ready for hunting and cultivation in the spring. So by the time the trustees of Columbia University purchased this land in 1893, an entirely different regime of land and resource management had taken place. For example, the trustees hired the Olmsted brothers, sons of Frederick Law Olmsted, to survey the site and produce a, quote, tree planting scheme for the new university campus. So on this pockmarked site, we can see not only where Olmsted marked which trees are dead, which trees are near dead, which trees should be kept, where birds take baths, and which plants should be relocated. We also see a fundamental distinction being made between what is allowed to burn and what is not. That is, where there can be wood and where there cannot be wood. So let me just take a moment and let's start with the wood. What we see here is a highly curated collection. The woods that the Olmsted inherited have been grown to serve as the campus for the Bloomingdale Asylum, which was on this site before Columbia, one of the first ever hospitals devoted exclusively to mental health, where diseases were newly thought to be genetic and the experience of landscape, especially a wooded landscape, restorative. So there had once been a farm on the site, and with some infrastructural adjustments, the landscape became a painterly vista for the patients. One of these adjustments that I just mentioned was the addition of the plants from the exotic foliage imported from worldwide from the Elgin Botanical Garden, which had spent a little bit of time in the 1830s Midtown, and were donated to this site in the 1830s. So the patients were expected to tend to these plants once they were in the gardens, improving themselves and the grounds in the same time. And in fact, it was those inherited shrubs that Olmsted was especially interested in, taking pictures of them and recommending that they be relocated at the corner of Lower Library. And that's his photograph. Okay, so what about fire? Well, if you look closely at Olmsted's plan, you can see between the path and the trees, there are notes of coal chutes where a different kind of energy source is being fed to the steam pipes in a new and extensive system of tunnels, providing water and fire and heat to the patients in the massive brick building. So in other words, trees above, fire below. If there's one place where the burning of fire was allowed to remain, where the burning of wood was allowed to remain, it was, and became a kind of bespoke experience, it was this building, this room that we're in today. So this is the Macy Villa, the building we're in, which was built in the 1860s as part of an experimental pavilion system for the convalescence of a new, wealthier type of hospital patient who could afford a more domestic scale of care, including living but with a room with a dedicated fireplace. So there's a fireplace right there, there's another one over there. So rather than being asked to tend to the plants in the garden, these patients were allowed to gather their own firewood at a leisurely pace in the woods around. So while much of the architecture that we're in today is no longer made of wood, the last wooden architecture to be near this site was this kind of shanty that was relocated when the campus was built. The line between what is allowed to burn, what is not allowed to burn, is continually drawn and redrawn, including by design. And if we're to believe the news, this is a very unstable distinction. So this is the fire that spontaneously erupted in Prospect Park recently. And perhaps we can hope that also, to return to my starting point, that the energetic and environmental value of indigenous fire burning can continue to rise, as indeed there's now indigenous preventative practices, which are earning a new space in the kind of carbon exchange economy and climate mitigation ecology. So let me get to today's event. I couldn't have told you the story, I just did, if first of all I didn't have the amazing talents of the researchers that the Bureau has been using in the last few years. And also if I had not read the work of our three presenters, who have all written very evocatively about wood and fire and coal and the economy and the spectacle that attends to them. So I'll just introduce them one after the other, and today we're trying to just have them one at a time so the other person doesn't have to sort of crank their neck as they present. So our first talker will be Daniel Immerwahr, who is Bergen Evans Professor in the Humanities, as well as Charles Deering McCormick Professor of Teaching Excellence at Northwestern University, where he teaches US and global history in the history department. He's a contributing writer at The New Yorker. His most recent book, How to Hide an Empire, has earned many prizes. He's working on a fire history of the United States and has a past at Columbia GSAP, so we're very proud to have him. Please join me in welcoming Daniel.
The title that was advertised on the posters, we shifted a little bit just to make the panel cohere a little bit. This project is from a book of mine that I'm working on, tentatively titled "This Too Shall Burn: America in the Age of Wood," it proceeds from two fairly straightforward observations, but I think things that turn out to be important and are worth thinking hard about. One is that the United States and North America are full of forests, and as a result, have historically had a built environment that is comprehensively wooden. So that's no longer the case today, but up through the end of the 19th century, there were wooden cities throughout the country. And the other fact is, as a result of that, the country was alarmingly combustible. These are two lithographs of Chicago, the city where I'm from. What I want to talk to you about today is from an article that I published last month in a journal called Past and Present. All that is solid bursts into flame. And it's an attempt to use this kind of wood fire point to delve into some questions that historians have been wondering about to do with the nature of 19th century capitalism, the century when the United States most vigorously and visibly adopted capitalist institutions. And I want to sort of suggest that there's actually a kind of debate in the literature about what it means to become a more fully capitalist country for the United States in the 19th century. Some of the literature, and tends to be the older literature, takes a sort of Weberian view of this. I call this the cold capitalism analysis. The idea is that the process of encountering capitalism and adopting capitalist institutions has been one of rationalization, standardization, coordination. It's when things that used to be different became the same, and the kind of whole economy and the society around it became more machine-like. After the financial crisis of 2007-8, you started to see a different set of literature or a different set of writers who were less interested in the inexorable sort of machine-like features of capitalism and started getting interested instead in the chaotic features. And rather than Max Weber as their kind of preferred theorist, they tended to lean toward Karl Polanyi, who argued that sufficient commodification would drive a society toward a form of unsustainable chaos. And so this set of historians got really interested in counterfeit currencies, uncertainty, booms and busts, confidence games, all that kind of thing. And I've just put out two books that I associate with it. So that's a point about the literature. The point that I want to make now is that that tension between does the market make things more rational or does the market make things more chaotic, that's not just an interpretive question. That was a question that people were asking at the time, had views about, had ideological clashes about, and it all was undergirded by a sort of material dimension. And the question for them is, you know, what do we do with the fact that this country has historically and increasingly is encountering an enormous number of fires. It's not just that the United States was fire prone, it's that in a way that people noticed at the time, particularly the sites of intense commodification were fire prone. So settler cities that had just been sort of come up in real estate speculation, mining towns, the commodification of people in the form of slavery often, as people noted at the time, led to fires as enslaved people set them. The commodification of risk in the form of insurance led to a lot of fires in the forms of insurance fraud. There's a lot of visitors who come from Europe to the United States observe both how wooden the country is and how flame prone it is, and they often just sort of this is what they remark on. This country seems to be sort of fiery with speculation. And the article talks through that connection in a way that I don't want to do today, but I just want to bring up one point, which is in the concern about the relationship between commodification and particularly fire, 19th century people develop a stereotype that we no longer have today. They pick the group of people who they most associate with commodification, Jewish people, and they accuse them of being arsonists. I am Jewish. I had never encountered this stereotype of Jews as firebugs. Nevertheless, it is so prevalent in the 19th century that there is a technical term within the insurance industry to refer to properties that are probably going to be, or that might be subject of fraudulent arson. And that technical term is called Jew risk. That's how they refer to it in their reports. Okay, so that's the kind of setup, is that everyone can see that the country is undergoing a lot of fires, and it seems to have something to do with market, and particularly places where things are getting commodified are burning a lot. And what's interesting about this is that once people understand that, they have a series of different views about what to think about it. One of the most striking things for me, as I've studied the history of burning, is to see how many people seem to be kind of okay with it, or even root for it. This is the flag of my city, Chicago. And I just want to point out that one of the 4 stars, each of which is supposed to commemorate some kind of historical episode, represents the fire. The worst day on our history is on our flag. I will also point out that 2 of the other stars refer to structures or places that burn down as well. But that is completely uninteresting, because it is also true of San Francisco, which has a phoenix rising from the flames. It is also true of Atlanta. It is also true of Lawrence. Detroit just has a woman in front of a flaming city. And of course, the number of places in the United States that are called Phoenix, there are like 27 such places, by the way. That's the flaming city, in front of the flaming city. There is a sort of ideological interest in fire. And in the article, I go through some of the people who are speaking on behalf of fire, and I'll just present one of them to you now. It is kind of the guy who's most associated with the fastness of the economy, with the hucksterish qualities of the economy, P.T. Barnum, who is famous now for circuses, but because that's the kind of legacy, the continuous legacy he left, but at the time was running museums where there would be sort of, you know, the skeleton of a mermaid, and everyone would be like, that can't be real, can they? And he's like, well, you come to my museum and pay me a lot of money and find out. P.T. Barnum was also, and this is less recognized, one of the most fire-prone individuals in the 19th century. There were 5 times when he nearly lost it all in some major fire, as well as other minor fires or threats of fires that surrounded his life. And that became part of how he presented himself. And he said, you know, I am a creature of boom and bust. I am someone who comes back after losing it all, and let me tell you, the fires are blessings in disguise. This term gets used over and over in the 19th century quickly in relation to major fires. So New York burns down, or much of New York burns down in 1835. Immediately, papers are saying, perhaps it was a blessing in disguise. Same thing about Chicago's fire. And I was trying to sort of puzzle out, what is this view of the world that you would welcome a fire? And my sense is that it is actually a comprehensible economic theory, and one that isn't so far away from a theory that we might be more familiar with, Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, where he argues that wars and other things that make capital less profitable, including progressive taxation, they all have an effect of, a sociological effect, of making it hard for accumulated wealth to persist. The market becomes a more turbulent place, and it is harder as an economic incumbent to just stay on top, reinvest your profits, and assume that you will be on top the next day. The more turbulent the market is, the more mobility within the market there will be. And I think that's what a lot of people like P.T. Barnum have in mind. It tends to be the middling folks who are most interested in economic mobility, who want to see a tumultuous world around them, perhaps with a vision that plutocrats will be flung from their perches. One really striking example of this, of the possibilities, the economic possibilities that come with fire, has to do with some of the people who get very rich in the United States. In fact, a striking number of the people who get very rich in the United States, who by the late 19th century are the sort of, robber barons of the Gilded Age, start out at crucial early points in their economic careers, often when they're just entering the workforce as, young teenagers, often are in places that have just experienced major fires. And as a result of that, usually what happens after a fire? Weirdly, there's an employment boom, as there's a lot of new construction being built. These fires don't tend to kill a lot of people, but they tend to sort of reshuffle the economic deck. And if you are a young man on the make, that can be a pretty good place to find yourself. So I call these people salamander capitalists. There was a mythology that salamanders were born in flame. That is not true. What is actually true is that salamanders nest in rotten logs. So if you put a log on the fire, the salamanders will dash out, and it will look like the fire is giving birth to the salamander. So these are the salamander capitalists who are born in flame. And one example, a prime example, is John D. Rockefeller, whose family moves to a town in New York right after it suffered a major fire, and as a result he can avail himself of a lot of the post-fire economic opportunities. He's not the only one. Andrew Carnegie does exactly the same thing, arriving in Pittsburgh after its great fire. John Jacob Astor's biographer says the reason he got rich is that he arrived in New York City right after an 18th century fire, at the precise moment of its rebound, when all the opportunities were in play. J.P. Morgan, it's a little more complicated, but his familial wealth comes from insurance, and particularly from sort of Game of Thrones style move that his firm is able to make after a New York fire in 1835. And then just to complete our set, Thomas Mellon, the sort of first of the Mellon fortunes, starts out as, raised in a log cabin, much like Abraham Lincoln, but he switches from real estate and then into finance because he's able to buy up cheap properties after Pittsburgh's Great Fire. We've had a couple of economic historians who have studied what happens when there's a large fire in the urban past in the United States in the 19th century, and the answer they generally find is this. Locally, fires are great for the economy. There's usually an influx of people moving into a city after its fire rather than the other way around. They are, however, terrible for the larger economic system. The insurance industry is hurt, the reinsurance industry is hurt, and it's not entirely an accident that a lot of the major fires in US history are followed by economic depressions 1 or 2 years later as the systemic shock works its way out. So this can be good for a lot of people. However, the people for whom it is not good are the very rich, are the people with the most property, the most things that can burn up in flame. And you see this really interesting moment when, as they start getting rich, these salamander capitalists, the very people whose fortunes came from flame, start to rethink their relationship to fire. And the best example I have of this, sorry, the slide seems a little weird, is Andrew Carnegie, who'd been in finance, which had been associated with sort of fiery booms and busts. He is in the midpoint of his economic career. He witnesses a wooden bridge burning that's part of the Pennsylvania Railroad that sort of shuts down the railroad. And then he concludes that this is everything that's wrong with the world, and he wants to reform himself. He wants to make something tangible, and he switches to iron making from finance. John Levy, who will speak here later, in a recent book says, it is completely unclear why he is doing this. This is not a financial decision, this is a spiritual decision. He wants to make something incombustible. He's worried about fire. I think not just in the way that we all fear fire, but he's worried about symbolically what fire means for the economy. And if he's worried about that, he is not the only one. A lot of the sort of plutocrats of the Gilded Age get into fire insurance in various ways, and I want to draw your attention not just to the fact of large fire insurance firms that are interested in fire control, but just what they look like. So this form of architecture, which we're really familiar with and we associate with the late 19th century, I just want to point out an obvious feature of it. It's stone. It is different from the wooden bridges that had just built. It is, in fact, performatively non-combustible. And there had been a tradition in the United States of what was called fireproof architecture. And it started in basically with the early Republic, first building prisons that wouldn't burn, and that's just for a very practical reason, which is that prisoners would often burn themselves out of wooden prisons. It's really easy to do. So okay, prisons have to be made of something other than wood. But actually, the other thing, very quickly after the prisons, the other things that are built of not of wood or of brick or stone are financial institutions. And on the one hand, it makes sense. You don't want the bank to burn down. But if you make a list of all the other things you don't want to burn down, that list would also include courthouses, orphanages, theaters, all kinds of things. But it's particularly banks that are fireproof. And I think that is, there's a kind of performative, symbolic, or ideological dimension to it. And it doesn't just happen with the financial institutions. It happens with the homes of the very rich, which start to resemble, to our eyes, banks. And here is the Vanderbilt mansion built by McKim, Mead, and White. The part of the contrast, I think, in everyone's head is not just people like Barnum, but particularly P.T. Barnum, who seemed to welcome the flames. And this is Barnum's museum, which is a large building, and it's not made of wood, but it looks real burnable. And you know, there's just a kind of sense of this is a place of commerce, this is a place of traffic, people will come in, people will go out, it will be stuffed with things, those things will be flammable. And unsurprisingly, there had been a major fire at Barnum's Museum in 1865. By the way, this is to clarify, this is the fire in 1865. He rebuilt it, and there was another major fire in 1868. As that burned down, this is something that the rich are thinking about, and they're thinking about it when they built, for example, the museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is, by contract with the city, has to be built with the most comprehensive fireproofing available at the time. And the whole thing is sort of performatively the opposite of the kind of museum as Barnum sees it. Museums look like this, homes look like this. It sort of goes throughout the late 19th century. You just see this deep interest in imposing buildings, often rendered of stone or things that look like stone. I got really interested in a set of builders that I'm wondering if they will be familiar. It's not McKim, Mead, and White, but it's the construction guys who work, who subcontract for McKim, Mead, and White, the Guastavino Fireproof Construction Company. They are some of the most impressive builders of the late 19th century. They're not the architects. They're the ones who are brought in to do complicated spanning elements, and they have a patented method to do that using these domes that it just sort of, all of the major buildings of the era are built using Guastavinos. And so I think what we're seeing here is a kind of argument in materials, argument in stone versus wood, about what the economy is supposed to look like, what the society is supposed to look like, what the future is supposed to look like. In my article, I go through a lot of science fiction novels that are written at the time and ask, what do people think the future is going to be built out of? And the answer is, in England, there's this kind of longing for a restoration of the forests. In the United States, there's all kinds of incombustible elements, you know, aluminums and cements and that kind of thing. And I won't go through all that. I just want to point out one durable work of speculative fiction that we know about and we think about, but I don't think we see as a kind of containing an argument about materials and material culture. And that work is The Wizard of Oz. L. Frank Baum, the author of The Wizard of Oz, is a theater guy. Theaters were notorious for burning. And in fact, he wrote a play called Matches about ignition. And one of the theaters that his family had operated in an oil boomtown, that is another place of combustibility. The theater had burned to the ground, destroying. We actually have lost a lot of his plays because they burned. Then he moved around and he got interested particularly in Chicago, which he said has become very busy and energetic after the rebuilding from the Great Fire. So he's one of the people who moves to Chicago after the fire. Sorry, this is the 1871 fire. I want to distinguish it from the 1874 fire that Chicago suffered that was also quite serious, after which the city elites formed the Fireproof Party, crossing party lines in order to try to fireproof the city, which they did. So they tried to at least build up the downtown core in the sort of brick and stone and marble and that kind of thing. But this was rough on the workers who wanted cheap housing. So the city had in its core sort of fire limits, and you couldn't build any more from wood within those limits. But right outside of them were a set of neighborhoods where you could build in wood. And one of those neighborhoods is called Humboldt Park, which was filled with wooden buildings, still is today. It was right over the fire line. That is where L. Frank Baum lived. So he was sort of part of the wooden culture, gazing over into the fireproof culture. And I want to argue thinking about that. The Wizard of Oz starts with a combustible wooden building, and the second sentence of the novel talks about where they got the wood to source, for where the wood came from for Dorothy's house. He's thinking about it a lot. But his story about someone who grows up, who's in a combustible and disaster-prone environment, who is whisked to a conspicuously incombustible environment full of yellow brick roads, tin men, silver shoes, marble pavement, china houses. And a lot of the tension of this is, where does Dorothy feel most at home? It's a tension that L. Frank Baum is living with because he's living on the fire line. And what you see is that Dorothy sort of crosses over into the fireproof world and sees many wonders, but realizes it's not quite for her and makes her way back. Okay, thank you so much. And Matthew.
Our next speaker is Matthew C. Hunter, who teaches in the Department of Art History and Communication Studies at McGill University, Montreal. He's the author of Painting with Fire and Wicked Intelligence. He has recently co-edited a special issue of Oxford Art Journal on art and the actorial imagination, and he is an editor of Great Room. Please welcome Matthew.
Thanks all. I'm going to be more, I don't know, whatever. I'm going to sit down. I'm also going to read to you, just because that's brilliant. That was a brilliant talk, Daniel. I'm delighted to follow it. I feel sort of... okay. So around 1886, real estate broker R.J. Cresap & Co. announced the sale of new lots in the Amazon Park housing development. Located in the leafy suburb of Clifton, some 5 miles north of Cincinnati, Ohio, Amazon Park now bears little resemblance to the ways in which the Amazon and South American landscapes were conceived then. Its streets are lined with deciduous trees and tract homes, not the palms, the lurid flora, and hanging moss dramatized by Martin Johnson Heade and his postbellum artistic ilk. Yet the subdivision's titular Amazon was never meant as a reference to South America, or at least not directly. Instead, the development took its name from the Amazon Insurance Company, a Cincinnati-based fire underwriter incorporated in the summer of 1871. Now, maybe the 1880s advent of Amazon Park is interesting if we know how and when recent studies figure insurers' ventures into the real estate game. Kaylee Horan, for example, has stressed that US state laws prohibited life insurers from real estate investment well into the 20th century. That conversation shifted through national housing shortages and the collapse of the banking industry in the Great Depression. And by the mid-1940s, Horan argues, quote, laws prohibiting investment in residential real estate by by life insurance companies had been amended or repealed in all but 7 states. So the mighty pump usurping urban action once exerted by the octopus of the railroads, in Elihu Rubin's terms, life insurance companies, per Sarah Stevens, quote, began funneling money into new construction and real estate equity after World War II. Sure, Amazon Park is far less ambitious than Parkchester, Stuyvesant Town, and other life insurance-driven projects, but it is also more than a quarter of a century earlier and propelled not by insurers of life, but of fire. To accent fire is to recall the origins of Anglo-American fire underwriting itself in real estate development. After all, the first durable fire insurance company had been opened in the Royal Exchange circa 1680 by Nicholas Barbin, who was post-fire London's premier property developer. Fire is also key, I think, to Amazon Park and its modeling of abundance. For the project was catalyzed by fire not in the woody uplands long occupied by the Miami peoples, whose name registers on the subdivision's northern border. Instead, the salient fire burned along the shores of Lake Michigan. The 17,000 plus structures immolated in the Chicago fire of October 1871 would destroy the Andes Insurance Company, not Amazon, Andes. That was the corporate matrix from which Amazon had been born less than 6 months earlier in a scheme to circumvent Ohio state law restricting fire insurance companies to $1 million capitalization. So, born of Andes, Amazon and its proverbial mother were both sired by Joseph Bray Bennett, the British-born underwriter who had directed the western branch of the Hartford-based Aetna Insurance Company from 1853 until early 1870. It is worth tarrying with Bennett, I think. An avatar of Chandlerian managerial culture to which Daniel has already gestured, and its paper forms, Bennett introduced or formalized numerous visual techniques into the fire insurance game. His 1857 Agent's Manual, which we see emblazoned with the facade of the Western Branch's office at 171 Vine Street in Cincinnati, which was a block from where the Amazon Andes conjoined office would stand years later. This manual formalized practices of risk diagramming that became standard across the 19th century industry. Diagrams of risk were then built into corporate paperwork. From 1857, Aetna began apportioning drawing space in its pre-printed application forms. In those blocks, the insurance applicant was to draw the footprint of her property in colorful, if schematic terms. So giving graphic form to the simple risk rating introduced by Barbin in the 17th century, black lines meant wooden structures, red lines indicated stone or brick. I've seen thousands of these diagrams. There are probably millions of them that were produced. They became industry standard for pricing fire insurance premiums. And more consequential still was Bennett's recruitment in 1866 of surveyor D.A. Sanborn, whose eponymous company and cartographic genre would dominate insurance mapping for the next century. Beyond these images useful for the production of inferential knowledge about fire, however, Bennett also commissioned dozens of images of fire. Through the 1850s, Bennett's Aetna advertisements cast urban fire as both threat and promise, as terrifying presence, and as object of rational management through the company's capital, real estate, and other financial holdings. Yet, Bennett's spending on advertisement, and in particular on this 2-foot by 4-foot ad dramatizing fire at the Colt Pistol Factory in Hartford, Connecticut in 1864, would be his mythical undoing. According to Aetna's authorized corporate history, at least, the Home Office was outraged to find, quote, a receipted bill for $4,000 for a colored poster of Colt's fire, a stupendous expenditure for advertising purposes. And here I will cut to the chase. For fired by Aetna for his mooted recklessness in February 1870, Bennett would establish Andes Insurance Company 6 months later. expanding Andes' capitalization in mid-1871 through creation of Amazon Insurance, Bennett would be wiped out by that fall's Chicago fire. Andes was suspended from trading in summer of 1872, but Amazon survived, and the company seized Bennett's assets, including his personal estate in Clifton, which it then developed circa 1880 as the Amazon Park subdivision. Now, there's one additional wrinkle to add to all of this abundance. Note the name of the first director listed in Bennett's cult fire ad, Joseph Church. That was the father of landscape painter Frederick Edwin Church. Church père sat on Aetna's board of directors for more than 40 years. And it's very likely that Bennett and Church Sr. knew each other, for surviving on a bookshelf in the living room of Olana, the younger Church's Orientalist fantasy dwelling overlooking the Hudson River, is a copy of the Aetna Bible, Bennett's 1867 Manual for Aetna Agents. The volume has been dedicated to the elder Church, signed by Bennett 1 month prior to his firing. Now, framed toward the biases of my own discipline of art history, maybe the story here is about the artistic uptake of insurance. A dominant force in the valuation, exhibition, and so-called life of art now, insurance has not always been a matter of artistic concern. As late as 1757, London's leading fire insurer counted pictures alongside cash, jewels, and gunpowder as items excluded categorically from indemnification. Frederick Church, however, embraced insurance. In June 1859, he sold his massive Heart of the Andes, which is now, as we know, in the fireproofed Met, for a then staggering fee of $10,000 to varnish magnate William Tilden Blodgett. The picture's sale contract stipulated that Blodgett had to pay Church $2,500 up front, but could not take immediate ownership of the painting. For in May of 1859, Church had already rented Heart of the Andes to James McClure, a Glasgow-based publisher. McClure would exhibit the picture in London and various American cities for the next 2 years. Exhibitor McClure was contractually bound to keep the picture, quote, insured in the amount of $10,000, both in transit by land and water and while on exhibition, unquote. So as with the practice of J.M.W. Turner some 6 decades earlier, Anglo-American traffic in sublime landscapes had thus become a highly securitized affair. We will see the connection to Bennett in just a moment, but it is fair to ask, was any of that insurential framework perceptible to Church's viewers? Certainly extravagant tales were told in the period press about the dangers and hazards braved by the painter, of Church's risk-taking in a non-technical sense. One London journalist claimed that Church had, quote, lived in the Andes until he became thoroughly impressed with the beauty and majesty of the scenery. Another imagined that, quote, he had spent months under a tent in the mountain passes of the Andes, unquote. Yet perhaps the most perceptive response had appeared before Heart of the Andes shipped to London. Reciting the usual praise of, quote, the luxurious shrubbery intermingled with brilliant flowers and still more brilliant birds and insects, unquote, an unnamed writer for New York's The Crayon arrived at a striking conclusion. Quote, every square inch of the canvas is covered with nature's statistics, unquote. Art historian Jennifer Robb has read such response as evidence that Church's art moved ambivalently in what she calls a culture of detail, both invested in particulars and anxious about their excessive abundance. Instructively, detail was then being claimed by Bennett as the cornerstone of the fire insurance game administered by Church's father. Bennett's 1857 Aetna manual intoned, quote, no business of the aggregate extent of ours is so dependent upon details, unquote. Yet to hear Bennett tell it in the mid-1850s, fire insurance had to be attentive to details, for it was not a matter of abundance, but a matter of scarcity. Writing amidst a wave of legislation then pushed in Midwestern states against interstate insurance companies, Bennett cast fire underwriting as a precarious business of razor-thin profit margins that provided no security if limited to state lines. Only through financial investments pooled from across the country and featured in his advertisements Could Aetna, quote, secure permanent income to the company independent of the business of insurance? In other words, fire insurance on its own was scarcely profitable, and Bennett rates the profitability at something like 3%. Revenue derived from large-scale capital investments could alone make insurance durable to disasters that would crush local players. So parsimoniously detail-oriented, because scarcely profitable, Bennett's vision of fire insurance was also, unlike Church's painting, not perceptibly statistical. Indeed, as recent scholarship has repeatedly stressed, life insurance had met mathematical probability and statistical calculation far earlier than had fire and marine underwriting, the period's other major branches of insurance. Richard Price's calculation of the Northampton table in the late 1760s often acts as an inception point for life insurance's domestication of chance, in Lorraine Daston's felicitous phrase. The usual story is that neither fire nor marine insurers kept statistics until deep into the 19th century. For his part, Bennett pledged fire insuring as capable of joining life insurers' prestigious probabilistic game. In the Aetna Bible, Bennett looked to a future wherein insurers could, quote, classify and discriminate fire risks into 54 separate classes, and knowing income and loss upon each to determine the average cost of insuring each species, end quote. Such frequentist regularities would be as reliable as the bills of mortality, Bennett claimed, that had once founded life insurers' probabilities. Now, what Bennett didn't say in his 1867 manual was that this actuarial future was then already some 15 years old. In the early 1850s, Aetna's home office had begun assembling data that conceptualized fire risk in a new way. Entitled Classification of Fire Risks, this project documents at biannual increments total monetary volumes in play, premiums paid in, losses or gains, and to a certain extent, some of the averages on, quote, the very 54 separate classes of risk pledged as utopian stuff by Bennett. Historian Mark Thibault has described this Aetna project as a landmark, quote, an impartial record of financial loss using quantitative data, effectively initiating U.S. fire underwriters' voyages into statistical analysis to justify decisions, end quote. Now, Bennett certainly knew of this innovative proprietary project. What he probably did not know was that the Hartford-based Eye of Statistical Power had been turned upon his own Western branch. For from the fall of 1866, the manuscript had initiated a campaign of staging the biannual performance of home and Western against each other. Is it too much to read the Aetna manuscript as a house divided, its risk data replaying the Civil War? I don't think so, at least not entirely. First of all, the manuscript shows that the Home Office was a much larger enterprise than the 2,500 agents reporting to Bennett. Hartford generated some 56% of the premium income and 60% of the company's total losses. And as we can see on the bar graph here, the volume of insuring done by the Home Office, especially in the corporation's two highest risk categories of stores and merchandise and dwellings and contents, roughly tripled that of the Western branch. Aetna's risk portfolio was also significantly asymmetrical, so top-heavy in its investments in stores and dwellings as to skew its overall activity. And in fact, when those top categories are removed, some interesting points appear. For example, in October of 1867, Western was actually doing more business in risk categories like barns and stables, which appear at the top, and gristmills than was the Home Office. However, by 1872, when Bennett had been fired, the Home Office significantly exceeded Western's volume in those categories. All this suggests that Hartford's operation was not only larger, but it was becoming more aggressive than was the Western branch. At the same time, however, Bennett's smaller operation also appears to have been more efficient. Weighted averages aggregating the volume at risk in all Aetna's categories show that Western consistently outperformed the Home Office during the time of Bennett's administration. In fact, despite its smaller size, Bennett's office generated more than half of Aetna's overall net gain between 1868 and 1870, an efficiency that only decreased after Bennett's firing in February 1870. In short, Aetna's then new risk data gives little to support the charge of Bennett's reckless management. If anything, it shows his operation to have been more efficient, if more risk-averse, than the Hartford office. And while I don't have time to elaborate the point here, I think a much more convincing explanation for Bennett's termination stems from his efforts after the Civil War to extend the footprint of his Western office into southern states, formerly controlled by the Home Office, actions for which he was repeatedly admonished. Yet, risk-averse as he appears to have been at Aetna, Bennett took a massively risky course once fired, for not only did he sue Aetna, but he would commission a large-scale oil-painted replica of none other than Church's Heart of the Andes from Cincinnati-based painter Robert S. Duncanson. And Bennett would name his new business venture after that well-insured picture. So Heart of the Andes became property of Amazon, became Amazon Park. To conclude, a proposition. Aetna's risk categories were more than an eye of statistical power trained in disciplinary attention on Bennett. They also produced a new conception of insurential abundance. We will recall that Bennett had regarded fire insurance as a scarcely profitable enterprise prior to his recklessly risky campaign of revenge against Aetna, built around a painting-cum corporation called Andes. The risk-adverse practice he had administered could only be operated by an interstate conglomerate with massive capital, using proceeds from its investment portfolio as security against major losses. Yet East Coast insurers were coming to look differently upon Western dwellings. Jonathan Levy has demonstrated brilliantly how, in the wake of the Civil War, debt on Western farm mortgages was increasingly purchased by East Coast life insurers, the same underwriters marketing life policies to farmers as security against the hazards of life under the weight of a farm mortgage. What if the story of insurance's movement into domestic real estate, or we might say return to domestic real estate if we take in the English example of Barbin as a prolegomenon, is told not as an investment of abundant capital held by 20th century life insurers, but as an invention of abundance from within 19th century fire underwriters' emergent risk data. After all, the new statistics produced by Aetna would have told the company that dwellings were a low-hazard money spinner. This point is made well by historian Mark Thibault, who observes that the statistics prompted Aetna to price insurance on homes as, quote, a hedge to balance its exposure to losses in more risky categories of property. Statistics help to make things happen. Contemporaneous with Ian Hacking's avalanche of printed numbers and Frederick Albert Johnson's economists plumbing numbers to determine the depths of Britain's fossil fuel bounty, statistics assembled by the Artists' Annuity Fund had told the London-based risk pool the worth of their spouses' lives. Those numbers showed the largesse the artists could pay to bring their average 1.5 children to maturity. My proposition is that the entry of insurance into real estate might be mapped not only through the splashy, large-scale projects of life insurers in the mid-20th century, but nearly a century earlier, as fire underwriters combed through their nascent actuarial tables, discovered sources of abundance slumbering in those risk portfolios, and developed their assets. Thank you.
Our talk for the day is given by Alec Bierig, who is assistant professor at the Daniels Faculty of Architectural Landscape and Design at the University of Toronto. I'm going to sit. He studies 18th and 19th century urban and architectural history. He's currently working on a book that examines the architecture, infrastructure, and culture of coal use in Britain between 1700 and 1849. He's also been a contributing researcher to various real projects, and he's my co-conspirator in the Abundance Project. So please join me in welcoming him, and then I'll let him take it away.
So not only am I going to read, but I also have no slides. So, thank you. So I'd like to begin by thanking Lucia for the invitation, and to Matthew and Daniel for these really great papers. Obviously, it's a big task to follow their work and their contrasting but equally accomplished modes of historical and rhetorical dexterity. I should also mention here that I was the kind of unintentional designer of today's event, since I suggested it to Lucia early this year after I saw Matthew present another part of this ongoing research, a talk that focused more on the photographic and diagrammatic techniques of 19th century fire insurance. So after that talk, I excitedly came up and told him about Daniel's past and present article, which I just read, and the many overlaps and collisions between their work. So as their papers have shown, I think both are uniquely suited to capturing the complicated, barely comprehensible wildcat energies of the mid-19th century United States and its dangerous and encompassing world-making and world-destroying ambitions. Which is another way of saying that I'll be particularly interested in what questions and thoughts they might have for one another, but I'll try to provide a few prompts and questions to begin with. So a word or concept that kept coming to me as I read these papers, and the full papers, of course, cover much more than the remarks were able to, and I'll try to cover those as I can. But the word I kept coming back to as I read the papers was solace. It's a weird word, maybe, and it's, of course, a kind of synonym for insurance or assurance. That is, I kept wondering about the emotional and psychological usefulness of the instruments that these papers describe. How did these men, and they're basically all men, of course, as we are all men too, how did they sleep at night during what can only be described as a time of upheaval and violent transformation? What comfort did a building or an insurance policy or a risk diagram provide? What consolation was there in an obsessively detailed painting or an unsparingly accounted ledger, or perhaps most elaborately, a narrative about the liberatory potential of fire destruction or the gleaming future of a fireproof city? So what solace did these objects and these visions provide? So another word for this might be what the historian and theorist Carl Polanyi, who Daniel brought up, called a counter-movement, the ways in which society as a whole acts to protect itself against the volatility of living under market capitalism. This, of course, is a well-known concept deployed in recent histories of capitalism, one of the guiding ideas of Jonathan Levy's now seminal book, mentioned by both of you, both in your papers but also in your talks, maybe. Freaks of Fortune, which has insurance at its center. But I wondered in the case of these papers whether we might describe the culture being described, as one that seems to reveal something related to this counter-movement but slightly different. So rather than the immense society-wide counter-movements towards what Polanyi called the self-protection of society, that these stories offer a series of kind of micro-counter-movements. Minuscule, constant reassurances that a manifestly unstable world was hiding a more stable order beneath. So one location of this might be in the resonances that Matthew identifies between the culture of insurance and what historian about Jennifer Robb elegantly calls the culture of detail, as he told us about. To put it differently, and perhaps more directly to Matthew, what is the fuller meaning of your title, Nature's Statistics? So the phrase, as you told us 2 minutes ago, comes from this anonymous review of Frederick Church's painting, Heart of the Andes. And in your paper, you seem to draw a connection between these expressions, between the immense amassing of detail on Church's canvas and the re-scripting of urban space according to the unsparing perspective of the insurance agent. The ways in which, as Ben proclaims, to repeat you again, no business of the aggregate extent of ours is so dependent on details. But more simply, I'd ask, what kind of work do you think these details and their aesthetic of exactitude were performing? You seem to suggest a connection between the culture of detail on one hand and the emergence of an actual aesthetics of the sublime on the other. The sublime, of course, is generally associated, as you gloss in your paper, with immensities and large scale, but is there a kind of sublime produced by this mass of particulars? And how might we reconcile these innumerable specificities against the countervailing requirement of insurance, which you also took us through, which is scale, large scale. So insurance only works as the pool becomes large enough to spread around risk. It is thus simultaneously invested in the very large and the very small. So in other words, we might say that insurance seems to enact a kind of scalar dissonance in its immense collection of these individualized, isolated cases. And so what was the role of this dissonance in this new actuarial or insurential sublime? So another argument in Matthew's paper is his closing speculation that his insurance men, and Bennett in particular, invented a kind of abundance that, quote, fire underwriters combed through their nascent actuarial tables and discovered sources of abundance slumbering within their risk portfolios and developed those assets. So basically, they found places to invest in their own portfolios. And he links this with this new ability with the emergence, again, which he just took us through, of mathematical probabilistic methods for calculating fire insurance. To repeat that point, a truly calculated quantitative fire insurance comes very conspicuously kind of late in its history, where techniques of statistical probability were employed for life insurance. As he just told us earlier, about a century earlier, similar methods eluded fire insurance until the mid to late 19th century, a transition that you underline. But where the turn to this full-fledged quantitative technique would seem like a turning point, another historian sees this somewhat differently, and I'm sure you're aware of this argument since I found it chasing down one of your references. So in his recent book, Prometheus Tamed, Fire, Security, and Modernities, Cornel Zwierlein writes about this moment in the history of fire insurance. He writes, it is true that mathematical theories of probability were not normally applied in the field of fire insurance until the mid-19th century, even if authors repeatedly invoked ideas of probability. However, of greater importance is the precision with which the total value of all buildings was determined for the purpose of insuring them. He continues, political arithmetic led to an appreciation of entire countries and cities based not on their characteristics, histories, and traditions, but as a number of buildings with a certain value. The insured sum, quote, constructed the capital of fire insurance. The whole feedback loop of insurance and rises in mortgage value and credit was also seen as a generation of capital. So it seems to me what Zwierlein describes here might be understood as an invention of abundance or a discovery of abundance on an entirely different scale. A decisive chapter in the capitalization of the built environment. A turning of architecture into capital through which its physical forms are more or less suddenly transformed into a kind of near drapery around which the true reality of capital that the buildings now are held to represent. What Zwierlein suggests is that fire insurance played a fundamental role in the constitution and generalization of real estate as such. One interpretation of this might be that fire insurance acted as a necessary counterweight, counter-movement consolation to this sudden and violent capitalization. Like capital itself depended on insurance, which was, this is a little metaphorical, but insurance was thrown like a rope to stretch between and tie together the fiction of land ownership on one hand and the fiction of the building as holding abiding durable value on the other. So it's interesting, to say the least, that this seems to happen in parallel with Daniel's hastily built, fully combustible boomtowns. It is as if the insurance itself comes in to assure settlers that their flimsy balloon frames are not just a few sticks thrown together, but indeed are participating in the civilizational goal of turning a continent into capital. So one spectacular manifestation of this new reality was insurance fraud. And this wasn't in Daniel's talk, but I'll quote him. As he writes in his article, with the regard of staging intentional fires to collect insurance value, quote, symbolically, insurance fraud was one of the purest economic acts possible. Complex, hard to monetize objects, i.e. buildings, were released from their physical forms to become abstract value. So it seems to me this very beautiful turn of phrase reveals something about the themes that both Daniel and Matthew explore throughout both of their work. The feedbacks between creation and destruction, wood and fire, wealth and capital. The act of insurance fraud is a daring and cynical one that reveals the limits of the system, laying bare the fundamental tension between use and exchange value that characterizes the commodification of the built environment. You can burn down your house and collect the insurance, but you'll have nowhere to live afterwards. But if insurance fraud, in a sense, calls the bluff of fictitious capital, I wonder if, following sphere line, we might understand insurance as a kind of contract or pact to live in the time of capital, where the reckoning is both infinitely solid and also endlessly deferred. So finally, for Daniel, I have 2 questions about wood. And the first one is a little bit more from the art. So Daniel is, of course, particularly invested in wood as the fundamental material that embodied and enabled the speed and unleashed the volatility of settler colonization, particularly in the 19th century. As the historian James Bellage puts it, boomtowns across the settler world, quote, literally ate forests. But in your article you write that, quote, in Europe, one can speak of an organic wooden culture giving way to an industrial capitalist one, not so in the United States. And this, I think, is a reference to someone very important in my work, E.A. Wrigley, and his notion that the organic economy based on wood, water, wind, and the photosynthetic restraint was replaced by a fossil fuel economy, which he calls the mineral economy. So I'll ask what I hope is not a too obvious question, but just because a culture uses an organic material, does that make it an organic culture? One mystery in this story for me was how settlers came to see as viable, possible, and reasonable to undertake the mass extraction of resources on a continental scale. So in a different talk of yours that I watched earlier this week from Bradcliffe, you argued that we should look at the 19th century United States, or perhaps the United States more generally, as, quote, the Saudi Arabia of wood. And this, of course, is a willful and another brilliant anachronism, but I think this clever transposition of wood and petroleum serves to kind of restate this problem. How did settlers come to treat the forest, an obviously organic form, as a standing reserve? Since I've kind of gone on too long already, I'll suggest 2 broad intertwined explanations, but I'd be curious to know about your thoughts about the balance between these. So the first would be to explain it as a kind of worldview, that Lockean dispossession is supercharged and generalized as a kind of extractive mentality. And so that would beg the question of the historical boundaries of this mentality, of where it comes from. And the second would be a more material explanation. Of course, they're not mutually exclusive, but the second would be a more material explanation that even if the United States in this period was only very kind of minorly and periodically non-organic, so even if this new world only appeared in its rails and its steam engines, perhaps those were the places that counted. And those thin kind of iron sinews sanctioned a broader rescripting of the built-in natural environment and enabled the extraction of time. So I just wonder what the balance is between those. So my last question, to wrap up, is also related to iron and about the direction of travel in your story. So the ultimate solace for the combustibility of the wooden world is, of course, as Daniel ended his remarks, is to somehow make a world that does not burn at all. And this is what leads to Andrew Carnegie's revelation, which you implied you included, after witnessing a catastrophic fire, that, quote, iron was the thing. You write how Carnegie's conversion to iron was a crucial example, following John Levy, of, quote, how capitalists were driven by more than profit-seeking. For Carnegie, it felt important, for not entirely economic reasons, to reject the fiery impermanence of finance for a career making incombustible metal. Iron represented the dream of a fireproof and also a highly anxious world, as my colleague Jonah Rowan has shown in surprising and complex ways. But by leaving us in the fireless iron and glass city, I think we encounter at least 2 problems that I'd like to think about. The first is about the problem of directionality or telos. In judging wood, the kind of first draft of this history, do you end up reinscribing or reinforcing the presumption of progress, and progress of a very certain form? That is, the unstable history of convulsive booming capitalism was only temporary and not permanent, since it manifestly progresses from instability to stability. So this is maybe a facile point, but I do wonder how you think of this problem, of how to deal with the problem of progress. And a related and final question is this. Are modern buildings agents of hot or cold capitalism? The obvious answer would be the latter. Buildings are dead matter, they restrain, they fix. But this leaves out at least the ways in which, even as the convulsive fires of the mid-19th century are brought to an end, buildings become hotter and hotter in the course of modernity, arrogating to themselves ever greater amounts of embodied and operational energy in their construction, composition, and operation. It's not entirely meaningless to say that, all else aside, an architecture of steel and glass is an architecture that runs extremely hot, even as it appears extremely cold. Architecture that looked modern did not do so simply by preventing fire, but by capturing and freezing this energy, as you know. So the modern built environment seems formed around this paradox for me. Buildings look stable and appear to have stilled these violent forces, but I think one interpretation of your article is to point to the ways in which the catastrophic fires of the 19th century have never really ended.
Yes.
Thank you.
Easy questions, easy answers. I mean, really, choose any to start the conversation you'd like to have the three of you or two of you discuss, and then eventually have people think of their questions as well. Dan, do you want to go ahead?
I want to re-ask a question that
Go ahead.
Alec asked of Matthew.
Yeah.
I get, you are entirely right, that by 1900, the fire insurance industry has become fixated on detail and precision. And we looked briefly at those Sanborn maps. The Sanborn Mapping Company mapped, describing features of every structure, 13,000 places in the United States by the end of its run. And urban historians look at these as if you want a portrait of actually what anything looked like in the 19th century, this is just this wealth of detail. Were they right? I think this is our question. Is everything is incredibly detailed, and there's so much detail, and it's actually a little hard to tell if A, the details are even correct, and B, if they lead to any kind of useful calculation. And my sense is that, I think this is kind of where Alec was going, was that it provides a lot of emotional consolation, and it legitimizes the whole thing. But these insurance companies are going out of business all the time. I'm not sure how effective it is. And you seem on the fence about it, so I'm curious.
Yeah, can we put up the slides? So one of the things that I found fascinating is this tension between the detail talk and exactly what it is that you're expected to put into your risk diagram. And I did an assignment with some of my undergrad students a few weeks ago where I asked them to imagine a risk and render it in the terms of the 1857 Aetna manual, then price their risk. And it was fascinating to see what always happens when I give this assignment, which is that the students populate the world of the drawing, which we could say is meant to exemplify this culture of detail, something like this. A business of detail that is a business that in aggregate is wholly dependent upon picking the right details, something like this. And the massive abstraction that you see in, maybe abstraction is too overdetermined a term to serve in this context, but the extreme level of generalization that shows up in the articulation of the features, where basically all that matters are these 17th century risk categories, ratings, of parsing between wood and brick or stone. And then a measurement to external exposures. Whatever, my students were aghast at this. It doesn't matter. How do I render windows? Irrelevant. How do I render the fact that there's an oil storage facility inside my risk? Doesn't matter. It's not in there. It's all of that is excluded from the risk diagram.
But that stuff is on the Sanborn maps.
Yeah, possibly. But I think that what is fascinating about the relationship between the Sanborn maps and these risk diagrams is these are the image techniques that are being introduced, formalized into the contracts as means of determining the corporate liability for insurance policies at the level of the individual purchaser amidst this larger rhetoric of detail orientation, and yet so massively generalized. So much is left out. And why is that? This is something that I have been sort of tossing and turning around, and my sense is that part of the story here is about a legal function, that what these drawings are meant to do is to stand up in court, and that they are meant to be able to communicate the abstraction and the incomprehensibility of insurance concepts and what exactly a risk is and what is material to a risk, and how these inscrutable concepts operate, which seem to transform architecture into a completely different register of existence. They are to make the scope of those concepts as clear and as indisputable as possible to juries, which insurance companies see as the bulwark of socialism. That this is where the common man is going to take down capital, is by the courts and by the constitutionally sanctioned instrument of the jury. And these are the kinds of combinations, or the meeting point between the culture of detail and the culture of abstraction that will make something so unclear and so inscrutable into something as simple as possible. Anyway, so this is, I guess, that negotiation between detail and complete lack of detail, between detail and abstraction, between a detail sort of forensic focus on specifics and the measurements of the site, and then a sort of rhetorical, epistemological, legal function that basically denies all of that, is crucial to understanding what these are doing. That is maybe not the same thing as what the Sanborn maps are doing, because they're made in a completely different physical scale, with different surveying techniques, where they have professional teams of surveyors, where they have a professional correction service, and so on and so forth. Anyway, I'm sorry, that's like a deep dive into nerdiana, but yeah, no, it's thank you for that question. It's totally great.
Do you want to try and answer to the modern architecture looks cool but runs hot?
Yeah, I love that. I thought that was such a, so yeah, it is obvious. I mean, we are in an age of hot capitalism, and that's why the heat of the 19th century is sort of more visible to us now. So I don't mean to suggest that this is a story of everything running cold until we get the Ice Age. And I loved what you said about the sort of illusion of architecture, that it's built to represent stability, and yet we've got to the point where we can see through that. That was well said, and I would counter-sign that. Yeah.
It looks like we're at the moment where we can accept some currently accepted questions from the room. Val?
Thanks. I think in both of your presentations, I'm kind of interested in this, like you've sort of introduced this dimension of like an ethical component to risk distribution. For example, on one hand, like Daniel, you were mentioning like the idea that fireproofing in Chicago actually made it more difficult for people to have housing in certain areas, like with the exception of certain neighborhoods. On the other hand, Matthew, you were mentioning like this, the idea of using houses as a hedge. So basically, they're going to like, you know, I guess normal. Well, I don't want to say normal, but like people who are essentially occupying those buildings are the people who are bearing a premium of risk for arguably the more combustible things that people are not occupying. So my question is like, how would you respond, like in the course of your research, how would you respond to each other in terms of what you've arrived at in terms of like, with the kind of ethics of risk distribution? Because I think there's something very interesting about the fact that the insurance, like the logic of insurance is that risk is supposed to sort of end here. And that requires this kind of faith, as you say, like solace of like the risk, you know, kind of ends here, but there's this step afterwards. And I'm curious, like, where do you see that transition, the redistribution of risk post-insurance company going, and how do you measure that, like, in the course of your research of these institutions?
That's a super question. Do you have a keen?
Yeah, no, it's right. So I will confess that I got into this research. I was fascinated by the sort of pyrophilia of the 19th century and disgusted by it. I was like, these people are insane. These are the people who want global warming. You know, like they're the ones who are rooting for catastrophes. And the more I became a fire guy, and the more I read the fire literature, I mean, one thing that happens when you read the fire ecologists and scientists working on wildfire is that they're not against fires. If there's a fire, they're like, oh, is it a good fire or a bad fire? And you're just like, there are good fires? And yeah, of course there are. And I came to sort of see that. I came to see fire and risk as potentially neutral, and to be more open to my historical actors who found themselves sympathetic toward fire and risk, partly because, I mean, we all like the welfare state and like I want risk to be distributed, but one of the, you can see why people in the middle of the society wanted a more turbulent society, and you can also see why, like, it wasn't just that the working class wanted wooden housing. They stormed City Hall and occupied it over the right to have wooden housing. So there's a balance between risk and accessibility. And I think that once you kind of lay that all out, it becomes a lot harder to just be on the side of minimizing risk. I don't get the sense that we're far off from each other, and I don't think so.
I think that's right. And I mean, I guess I would add that my project is part of a sort of larger inquiry into, as gestured to here briefly, about when and how is it that art comes to be made porous to insurance. Insurance plays a huge role in administering and governing, valuing, allowing to move or not move art objects in our current moment. And my own discipline of art history really doesn't have much to say about that. When does that story begin? You know, sometimes in what available stories we have, it's either a mid-1960s or sort of post-war development or a late 19th century development or something like this. And so anyway, I wanted to track it back as far as I can go in the sources that are available to me. And I've thought about trying to do this in a bunch of different ways. And it feels to me like the most convincing archive evidence that I can find is in the late 18th century in London. And it's with Turner, who I mentioned briefly here. And this is interesting because Turner is often thought of as the maker of the great depiction in the Western canon, if you want to use those terms, of the cruelties of insurance logic and the slave ship, the slavers throwing overboard, the dead and dying type thing coming on, which is usually understood as a painting that meditates upon the Zong massacre of 1781 and the execution of enslaved persons, then reclaiming the cost of this loss from the ship's underwriters. And yet, Turner is not only extensively involved in the acquisition of insurance policies on his art against fire, investment in fire insurance companies. We also know that he's involved from 1805 in Tontine, a sort of life insurance policy with John Julius Angerstein, an important insurer at the Lloyd's of London, that is entirely leveraged upon plantation slavery. And so Turner also then writes fire insurance into the terms of his will and his bequest to the National Gallery, which is staged inside Angerstein's home, which is Angerstein's a massive collector of art, and his collection is nationalized in 1824. And so all of this then goes to, I think, complicate the image that we have of the slave ship, which is often this sort of ethical icon in a lot of ways that plays an important role in staging criticality around the cruelties of insurance. And yet, the painter who's made it is very heavily knowledgeable of insurance logic. So I think the ethical dimensions of insurance and its both positivities and its repressive dimensions is absolutely something which are flagged both by period actors, is absolutely something central to what I'm trying to do in the project. So thank you for your excellent question. It's very, totally right on.
I think we're hitting the wall of the time, but please ask a question. Go ahead.
Well, Daniel, actually, you moved me to think about one of the more enduring post-war terminology inventions that come out of the theatre of
Iron Curtain?
the Iron Curtain. Yes, I was just wondering about that, but that's not really what my question is about. What's capitalist about this? I mean, it's about the circulation of capital, the marketism and so forth and so on, but is there production in the elongation of that issue?
Yeah.
Fire as creative destruction. You didn't mention Schumpeter, but that is the obvious kind of reference in the Bavarian context.
Yeah.
And then you think creative destruction, the most creative destruction that we have is war. And so is there a kind of ideological connection with the idea of war? Fire bombings?
Yeah, so one way you can do it is if you want to tell the history of the United States in fire, you have to acknowledge the fact that the most serious conflagrations seem to go out by World War I, but by that time the United States is now setting fires in other places. So and then now we're getting the fires of climate change, so there's a kind of perfect continuity. Yeah, no, this is not a story that dwelled on the productive faculties of the economy except in the construction industry. So the places where the most interesting production of anything happens in the story is the arguments over the production of space, right? Who's going to produce it under what terms, etc.
Actually, so that leads me to my question, which is that you, in this talk, you didn't specifically distinguish between natural environment, built environment, or you did, but you didn't gesture to how this was a very urban story.
Yeah.
So can you just, in a few points, gesture to what that means for the non-yet urban spaces that are also, being either consumed into built environment, or on the contrary, becoming, remaining somehow, kept as raw material or something like that?
Yeah. So, I mean, an interesting thing about the United States is that, well, this is generally true everywhere. The built environment is built out of the natural environment, but it can be more true in forested areas in the sense that the materials are hauled less over shorter distances. And it is often the case in the non-urban areas that all of the materials that might go on to building at least this kind of rudimentary habitation will be drawn from one's own land, which is actually incredible. And that's a major determinant of the pace of settlement in the United States. I'm working on a paper now about settler colonialism can operate so quickly because the material determinants for settlement are much more readily available because of in forested environments.
I had a question that I wanted to ask Daniel.
Go ahead.
This is sort of, we had talked previously about this business of the Frost and Jones fire gap story, and one of the things that they've mentioned is around what you've gestured to previously about the decrease in these large-scale fires in the early years of the 20th century, having to do both with the creation of buildings out of simply more durable, less flammable materials, but also shifts in lot size, and that lands in the United States are plotted on greater lots.
Yes.
And so more space between them, less densification, something like that. Does that concur with what you found? And
Yeah, because one of the things that makes cities like Chicago burn, I mean, independent of who owns the lots, is there's so much informal shanty-like building, but in any kind of available space, and that carries the fire. I mean, that both amplifies the fire, but it also carries the fire from one spot to another. Yeah, so there's a lot of things that put out the fires, different materials, better firefighting, better water services, but one of them is just more separation between buildings.
right, so I mean, I guess one of the things that, I mean, this is sort of a pedestrian comment, but I guess one of the things that I found myself reflecting upon is part of the story that we're maybe telling from different angles is rethinking of suburbanization. Like, is that where, as you see?
Yeah. So yeah, that's really good. My story ended with a sort of incombustible buildings, the skyscrapers, but another natural end for this would be the suburbs.
Yeah.
That's good.
So,
Yeah.
my sort of.
Yeah, that's really smart. Yeah.
And also what kind of environments insurance itself produces.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
Which is more the other topic, but that it promotes a certain way of looking that then is
The
rescripts.
desideratum and the
This
investment
invisible
opportunity.
thing
Yeah.
becomes.
Yeah.
Zainab has a question?
Hi, first of all, thank you for both talks and the response, which was very smart. I'm just wondering, as a general question, what is the role of economic history in all of this? So you're in a history department, Matthew, you're at an art history department. I'm just wondering the kinds of causality that economic history brings into your narratives, particularly at moments like, Matthew, when you were started show, and I don't know if you made those diagrams or your students make all the, I don't even know, I don't have the terminology, but it was almost as if capital has its own logic and you were following that logic for us. At other times, you bring other kinds of causality. For example, Daniel, when you talk about, for no discernible reason, was it one of those rubber balance goes from wood to iron, or you attribute it to a kind of almost like a psychological reason.
Yeah.
And at other times, you follow the Andes, Amazon, as if like you're a forensic scientist yourself. So I'm just wondering, what does economic history do? What does it do for your work? What work does it do for you? Are you trying to understand the logic of capital? Are you trying to dissolve the logic of capital? Are you trying? I mean, I'm just, there was a time when you wrote economic history into history, you did it with a certain kind of political agenda. I'm always, and it's not just you, I do the same thing in these new histories of capital. There's a certain kind of, what's the agenda? What work does economic history do?
I mean, I guess my hedge here is, I guess what's interested me in the historiography of insurance in particular is, yes, strong engagement and emplotment within histories of capital. That's what insurance gives. But there's also the Foucauldian direction and the Waldian's narration that this is, insurance is fundamentally about biopolitics and governmentality. And I'm interested in both those things, I would say. And I think that part of those are, of course, not mutually exclusive and mutually constituting something like this. And I think that part of what the project does, which is, I'll give the working title of the project is called Anglo-American Art, Moments in the History of Insurance. And it's constituted around a sequence of clusters between agents who are usually, for each of the chapters, there's one figure in the insurance game and one figure in the art game. And some of these are much closer to life insurance, which brings you more obviously and with less prompting into the biological register, or the biopolitical register, sorry. And others are in this fire insurance milieu, and there's others that are in marine insurance. And part of the argument of the project is to see these different ways in which artists and art projects are remade in insurential terms, and equally insurers take on the possibilities and the tools and the instruments of artists and images, more broadly speaking. So that's not an answer to your super astute question, but I think that as I said before, part of what I'm trying to do in this project is simply to excavate the horizons of a history of our current moment in a way in which insurance occupies these massive powers about which we know little, and to map points of sort of metastasis through which it is spreading and constituting itself via the spread through these artistic agents with whom it moves. So yes, economic analysis is certainly part of it, but I would say that doesn't exhaust the particular interest of insurance, because it also does the biopolitical work.
Dan, do you have a...
Yeah, I mean, economic historians and environmental historians at the edge can, if they want to play this game, they can assert, I am studying a complex system that kind of determines a lot of history. So you can really, once you really get down to the hardcore of either the economy or the environment, sort of everything else is stacked on top of that superstructurally. And there can be an ideology there, a particular Marxist one. For me, the question, it becomes, it's really important both to identify the environmental forces and the economic ones, but then you always have to ask the question, do historical actors recognize these? I mean, we can forensically see what's going on, but could they see what's happening? Do they see it in the same terms? And then how do they sort of ideologically perform it? So it helped me to understand that after FIRE's wages went up, working class wages went up, that helped me to understand what all of this pyrophilia was about. And I don't think I could have decoded it without having read some economic history. But on the other hand, you're absolutely right. A lot of the ways in which the economy gets staged or kind of culturally unfurled is not determined at all by the economic base, and there's a lot of sort of agency in economic actors about how they want to represent the economy and how they want to sort of build around it.
So now,
Just a minor question which kind of builds on what Zainab is saying. Can we think of this as a history of the salamander capitalists themselves as opposed to capitalism as is? And the reason I'm thinking that is, are you studying from the perspective, just your answer itself, the way you're describing how economics is experienced, is that studying the experience of how that is experienced, or is it studying the actors themselves? So, I mean, I'm always concerned with business histories as well, which try to assume studying some of these Gilded Age titans as an understanding for how we understand capitalism. But are we understanding the history of those capitalists, or are we actually getting closer to understanding the complexity of capitalism itself? And this is where I find that I really like the way you set up the stakes of what the debate is, but then the way that people have taken that on has been to shift actors from understanding how, say, real estate is experienced on the ground or other ways. So I just wondered whether you could speak to that distinction, or if there is a distinction at all.
No, I mean, I think there's a clear distinction. Presumably one wants to do both. So when I argue that the places of most intense commodification were also the places of conflagration, that's a statement about the economy and the environment, not about how people perceived it. And then when I make an argument about how people, what they could see and how they kind of play that fact out through anti-Semitic stereotypes, for example, that's a statement about ideology and a statement about ideas.
And that takes us to a resounding round of applause, hopefully. And